October 14, 1942, Berlin, 6:37 a.m. The fog outside was thick like soup, clinging to the corners of buildings as if trying to listen. Inside a room tucked away in the upper floor of the Luftwaffe's intelligence branch, the smell of burnt coffee and tobacco filled the air. A group of German officers sat around a long table littered with aerial maps, decoded messages, and intercepted American reports. One of them, Oberst Heinrich Kruger, tapped a file twice against the wood and let out a short, dry laugh. "It says here, the Americans are trying to build heavy bombers in a car factory." Another officer smirked beneath his mustache, lighting a cigarette. "Ford? The people who make milk wagons for housewives?" The room erupted in laughter. Not the loud, chaotic kind. It was colder than that. The laughter of men convinced that they were watching amateurs pretending to be warriors. In their minds, this was just another sign of American foolishness. Factories that once assembled automobiles were now being turned into airplane plants. Engines designed for trucks were being adapted for bombers. Civilians with oil-stained hands were being trained to build machines of war. "They'll build them like toys," someone murmured, "and they'll fly just the same." It wasn't just arrogance, it was certainty. From their perspective, Germany had spent nearly a decade preparing for the skies. Their engineers were some of the finest in Europe. Their planes were faster, sleeker, tested in real combat since the Spanish Civil War. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 had already carved its name into history. Their pilots were veterans, some with dozens of kills. Meanwhile, America was late to the party, scrambling to turn factories into hangars and workers into soldiers. But there was something else in that room that morning. A blind spot. A fatal one. Because what those officers couldn't understand, was that America wasn't trying to compete on finesse. It was betting everything on scale. While the Reich idolized precision, the United States was weaponizing quantity. And at the heart of it all stood a name they thought they knew: Ford. Henry Ford had once revolutionized the automobile industry by creating the first moving assembly line. Now his company was about to apply that same ruthless efficiency to the skies. The idea seemed absurd to German eyes. Warplanes were supposed to be works of engineering art, not something rolled off a conveyor belt. And yet, in Detroit, Willow Run was being born. At the time of that Berlin meeting, construction crews were already laying the foundations of what would become the largest factory under one roof on the planet. A building so massive that planners had to curve the western end to avoid violating the borders of another state. Inside it, Ford engineers dreamed not of elegance, but of volume. Bombers not hand-built, but mass-produced. Each screw timed, each worker choreographed, each plane rolling out in less than an hour. In Germany, this idea felt like comedy, but in America, it was a countdown. The Luftwaffe didn't see it yet. Their intelligence reports were riddled with sarcasm. American factories were referred to as barns. Their bombers were dismissed as overweight, slow, and laughably simple. Ford's B-24 was even nicknamed the Flying Boxcar by some German analysts, a nod to its blocky design. "A cow in the air," one Luftwaffe engineer sneered. But what they failed to grasp was this: it didn't need to be beautiful. It needed to fly. It needed to carry bombs. And it needed to be produced faster than they could shoot them down. Back in Berlin, the men in that room returned to their cigarettes and coffee. Outside, snow began to fall. They spoke of Stalingrad, of Tunisia, of U-boats. The world still felt under control. The American industrial machine was not yet feared. It was still being mocked. But quietly, thousands of miles away, gears were turning. Literally. Men and women with no history in aviation were learning to install engines, assemble fuselages, rivet wings. Housewives became machinists. Farmers became mechanics. Black workers, finally recruited en masse due to labor shortages, filled critical roles on the assembly lines. America was not only building planes, it was transforming its society into a war machine. And the symbol of that transformation was Ford's name stamped on a blueprint. At its peak, Willow Run would produce one B-24 every 55 minutes, day and night. No pause, no silence. A plane every time the minute hand touched the next tick. But back in that smoky Berlin room, they were still laughing. And they would keep laughing. Until the day came when hundreds of those flying boxcars darkened the skies over occupied Europe. When the thunder of their engines drowned out the sirens. when the war stopped being about speed or maneuverability and became a question of who could last longer. That was the true battlefield the Nazis never prepared for. Not the dogfights, not the aces, but the endless rhythm of a factory bell, the sound of logistics replacing heroism. And by the time they realized what was coming, it wasn't innovation that would save them. It was already too late. If this story gave you a new perspective, share your thoughts below. And if you believe more people should hear these forgotten chapters of history, hit subscribe and stay with us. It began as a blueprint on a cold Michigan morning, a dream scribbled on paper, but whispered in factories across America. While the Axis powers polished their uniforms and recalibrated their tanks, a different kind of battle was quietly unfolding on the outskirts of Ypsilanti. It was not fought with bullets or steel. It was fought with tape measures, concrete mixers, and coffee-fueled nights. And at the center of it all stood the impossible vision of a man who had once changed the way the world moved. Henry Ford. Willow Run was not supposed to exist. It was a myth in the making. A factory so massive, so complex, so absurd in ambition, that even many inside the U.S. military doubted it could be built on time. But in late 1940, as the drums of war echoed louder, the Roosevelt administration looked toward the one thing America had more of than any other nation: industrial courage, and few embodied that more than the Ford Motor Company. Construction on Willow Run began in the spring of 1941. The site chosen was a stretch of farmland just west of Detroit, empty, unassuming. But what rose from that soil would soon become the beating heart of American air power. By the time the first walls were up, the plans had already changed 3 times. It wasn't just going to be big, it was going to be colossal. The factory floor would eventually cover 67 acres. It would have its own water plant, its own power station, its own airfield. What made Willow Run unique was not just its scale, it was the very idea behind it. Henry Ford was determined to apply the same logic that once revolutionized the auto industry to the skies. He believed that if a Model T could be assembled by a moving line of workers, then a heavy bomber could too. Engineers called it madness. Generals called it reckless. Ford called it inevitable. Inside the facility, every inch was calculated. There were 1.2 million square feet of production space. Conveyor belts stretched for miles. Overhead cranes moved entire sections of aircraft with clockwork grace. Workers stood in rows, performing specialized tasks in rhythm with the hum of the factory. The same philosophy that had built 15 million Model Ts was now building B24 Liberators. It wasn't art, it was choreography. And it worked. But the process was not without chaos. The first planes took far longer to produce than expected. Supply chains buckled under the weight of new demands. There were labor shortages, training issues, mismatched parts arriving from suppliers not yet fully aligned with aviation standards. In the early months, it took Ford's team nearly 2 weeks to finish a single aircraft. The press began to question whether Willow Run would ever live up to its promise. Then came the pivot. By mid-1942, Ford's engineers had refined the process. They broke down each step. Time studies were performed on every motion a worker made. Inefficiencies were slashed. Automation increased. And suddenly, the line began to move. Slowly at first, then with staggering momentum. Within a year, Willow Run was rolling out one B-24 every 63 minutes. A month later, it was down to 58. Eventually, 55 minutes became the number carved into history. The sheer scale of operation was almost alien. The factory consumed enough aluminum each month to build an ocean liner. Each day, over 40 freight cars arrived carrying engines, wheels, instruments, radios, guns, and glass. The cafeteria served more meals than most restaurants in Detroit. And through it all, the floor buzzed with the sound of drills, rivets, and conversation. Workers came from all over the country. Some rode buses for hours. Others lived in hastily built housing complexes nearby. It was a society built around a single purpose: outbuild the enemy. One of the most remarkable elements of Willow Run was who worked there. The labor force was a mirror of America in motion. Men too old to fight. Women answering the call while their husbands were overseas. African American workers who had once been barred from skilled positions, now vital to the process. In the middle of the assembly line, race and class blurred under the weight of urgency. This was not just industry, it was transformation. To walk through Willow Run during peak production was like stepping into the lungs of a living machine. Everything pulsed. Everything moved. And yet, it was never frantic. There was order in the chaos. Every screw had its bin. Every tool had its place. Every worker knew that what they touched would soon fly across oceans, carrying men they would never meet, toward skies lit by flak and fire. What made it all even more astounding was that this operation was replicated across the country. Willow Run became a symbol, but it was not alone. Boeing in Seattle, Consolidated in Fort Worth, North American in Inglewood. The entire nation became a web of assembly and coordination. But Willow Run stood apart, not just for what it built, but for what it proved. It proved that war could be fought with wrenches, that patriotism could be measured in overtime, that speed was not always about engines, but about how fast you could adapt. It proved that a factory floor in Michigan could reach farther than a bomber's wingspan. In total, Willow Run would produce over 8,600 B-24s before the war ended, a number so vast that pilots began to refer to the aircraft not by name, but by number. They didn't ask who built it. They asked when it rolled off the line. The Luftwaffe never imagined this. They calculated for squadrons, not streams. They prepared for battles, not surges. No German general had planned for a world where air power came by the hour. And yet, that is exactly what was taking shape. What started as a joke in Berlin, a car factory building bombers, was quickly becoming the punchline to the Reich's own arrogance. If this part of the story moved you or taught you something new, leave your thoughts in the comments and consider joining us as we continue to uncover the lost chapters of World War II. Subscribe and help us preserve the history that nearly vanished. It was not sleek. It was not graceful. It did not turn heads like a Spitfire or strike fear with the silhouette of a dive bomber. The consolidated B24 Liberator was something different. It was a beast built for burden, wide, boxy, and unapologetically practical. At first glance, it looked more like a storage container with wings than a precision instrument of war. But that was the point. It was not meant to dance in the air. It was meant to carry weight. Lots of it. Farther, faster, longer. The B-24 was the answer to a question that had never been asked before. What if a bomber could fly across entire oceans, drop its payload, and still come home? When first designed by Consolidated Aircraft in 1939, the goal was clear. Outrange the B-17, outpace anything the Axis could throw back, and carry a bomb load that would make every mission count. What emerged from that vision was a machine that redefined what an air war could look like. Powered by 4 Pratt & Whitney R-1830 radial engines, the B-24 was capable of cruising at speeds up to 290 miles per hour. Its range stretched beyond 2,000 miles, depending on configuration. It could carry up to 8,000 pounds of bombs, double the payload of many aircraft flying at the time. And with a crew of 10, it was a flying fortress in its own right. Bristling with 50 caliber machine guns from nose to tail, it could hold its own in a dogfight for far longer than anyone expected from something its size. But the B-24 came with quirks. Pilots described it as heavy on the controls, stiff during takeoff, and dangerously temperamental during landing. The high aspect ratio wings, designed to improve range and fuel efficiency, made it unstable in turbulent weather and extremely vulnerable during emergency landings. Some pilots jokingly claimed that flying a B-24 was like steering a boat in the sky, and when shot up, it didn't glide. It dropped. Hard. The cockpit visibility was limited. The nose gear, unlike the B-17's tail wheel, changed ground handling characteristics significantly, and its hydraulic system, which powered everything from landing gear to bomb bay doors, had a reputation for failing at the worst possible moment. It was not a forgiving aircraft, but it was never meant to be. Where the B-17 was beloved, the B-24 was respected, and that respect was earned. Crews knew that the Liberator would take them places no other bomber could. It was used extensively in the Pacific Theater, where long-range flights over endless ocean made the B-17 obsolete. It flew low-level missions over the Ploesti oil fields in Romania, enduring some of the heaviest anti-aircraft fire of the war. It dropped supplies over China, hunted submarines in the Atlantic, and patrolled Arctic waters. No other bomber was asked to do more in more places. What set the B-24 apart was not just performance. It was availability. The modular design made it perfect for mass production. Its fuselage was composed of flat panels, making it faster and cheaper to assemble than the rounded bodies of other bombers. It could be split into sections, built separately, and joined with precision on the factory floor. At Willow Run, every rivet had its place, every pipe its measurement. There was no poetry, only purpose. As the war progressed, the Liberator evolved. Variants were created for every need, from cargo hauling to radar jamming. Some versions had extended fuel tanks for extra range. Others had fewer guns to increase speed. A rare few were stripped of everything except cameras for photo reconnaissance. The flexibility of the airframe meant the B-24 could adapt as the war changed around it. But perhaps the most powerful legacy of the B-24 is not in its design or its range or even its bomb capacity. It lies in the sound. Veterans who heard it remember the roar. 4 engines in perfect rhythm, generating a deep mechanical growl that could be heard long before the aircraft came into view. To civilians in France or Belgium, it was the sound of liberation approaching. To the Luftwaffe, it was the sound of inevitability. A German anti-aircraft officer once described it in a captured letter as the sound of a factory taking flight. That phrase stuck, because that was exactly what it was. Every B-24 in the sky was a message, not from a general, but from a workforce, a message sent by machinists in Michigan, by welders in Ohio, by women in overalls and teenagers barely out of high school. The B-24 was not designed to make a statement, but it became one. It said that America could take the concept of air power and multiply it, industrialize it, replicate it with terrifying precision. And that changed everything. When formations of B-24s flew overhead, they didn't come in pairs or squadrons. They came in swarms, entire wings of them, shadows stretching for miles, each one filled with fuel, bombs, and the kind of determination that is built, not born. The enemy could shoot them down, and they did. Hundreds were lost. Thousands of crewmen never returned. But for every one that fell, another rolled off the line, and then another and another. The B-24 did not earn its place in history with a perfect record. It earned it through persistence, through presence, through the sheer force of showing up again and again, even when the sky was burning. And in the end, that was enough. If this part of the story gave you something to think about, or helped you see this chapter of history in a new light, leave a comment and share your thoughts. And if you value stories like this, stories that dig deeper and remember the machines and people who carried the weight of the war, consider subscribing and joining us in preserving these echoes of the past. The first time the Luftwaffe faced a full formation of B-24 Liberators, they did not understand what they were looking at. From a distance, the boxy silhouettes in the sky seemed like a crude joke. They flew in rigid lines, wide formations that looked more like slow-moving clouds than strategic threats. But as the squadrons approached and filled the air with thunder, something shifted. The joke stopped, and reality landed hard. It was early 1943 over the Mediterranean, and the Americans were launching a deep raid into southern Europe. German fighter pilots scrambled with confidence. They had faced bombers before. They had danced circles around the B-17, and they expected more of the same. What they found instead was a wall of steel and firepower. Unlike the elegant fighters that graced the propaganda posters, the B-24s were machines of sheer determination. Each aircraft carried up to 10 crew members, and each position had a purpose. Waist gunners, tail gunners, turret operators. Their job was not to survive individually. It was to protect the formation, to hold the line long enough for the bombs to be dropped, long enough to send a message. As the German pilots dove in, they found themselves under relentless fire. The air bristled with 50 caliber rounds from every direction. Some fighters were hit before they could even close the gap. Others broke formation in panic. The Liberators fought back with a kind of unity the Luftwaffe had not anticipated. The Germans had underestimated not just the firepower of the B-24, but the philosophy behind it. Because the American strategy was no longer about elite dogfighting aces or daring maneuvers. It was about systems, processes, layers of redundancy. For every fighter lost, another would take its place. For every bomber hit, 5 more crossed the sky behind it. It was war by multiplication. Inside the German command structure, something began to shift. Reports from the front lines no longer carried the same tone. Field commanders began requesting additional flak batteries. Fighter squadrons were repositioned. Goebbels, the Minister of Propaganda, quietly instructed his team to reduce the use of American bomber footage in newsreels. Too many images showed cities under assault. Too many showed enemy aircraft surviving. He feared what the public might see. One of the most chilling admissions came from a Luftwaffe pilot captured in Italy. In an interrogation transcript later declassified, he described the feeling of hopelessness. "We attacked as ordered, but the sky was not a battle. It was a factory. They kept coming, no matter how many we shot down." That statement resonated beyond the interrogation room, because by 1943, American air raids had become more than military operations. They were industrial declarations. Factories like Willow Run were not just building planes. They were building pressure. Every hour, a new aircraft joined the fight. Every mission was a layer added to the storm. In Germany, denial battled reality. High command knew their air defenses were stretched. Fuel shortages were already appearing. Pilot training times were being cut. The once feared Luftwaffe was burning through men and machines faster than they could be replaced. And the B-24s had not even reached their peak deployment. Then came Ploesti. August 1st, 1943. Operation Tidal Wave. 177 B-24s launched a daring low-level bombing raid on the oil refineries of Ploesti, Romania. It was one of the most heavily defended targets in Europe, guarded by flak guns, smoke screens, and hidden positions. The Americans knew the risks, and they flew anyway. The mission was brutal. 53 aircraft were lost. Hundreds of airmen never returned, but the damage was done. Several refineries were destroyed or heavily damaged. The psychological impact was immense. The message was unmistakable. Even your oil is not safe. The Luftwaffe scrambled to adapt. New tactics were tried. High-speed interceptors, rocket attacks, coordinated flak traps. But nothing stopped the tide. The B-24s came at high altitudes, at low altitudes, in daylight, in waves. Every mission was another strike, not just at infrastructure, but at morale. One German general, in a moment of brutal honesty, confided in a colleague, "They are not fighting the war. They are manufacturing it." That truth echoed across briefing rooms and airfields, because the B-24s were not symbols of innovation. They were symbols of consistency, and consistency in war is lethal. By late 1943, German civilians began to notice the change. Cities that once felt untouchable now trembled under distant rumble. Children in Cologne drew airplanes in their notebooks with square wings. In the distance, the drone of engines became part of daily life. Not every flight dropped bombs. Some flew reconnaissance. Some never reached their target. But they all delivered the same message. We are coming back. Even Hitler, once confident in the supremacy of the Luftwaffe, began demanding answers. Why were the skies no longer German? Why did the Reich, with all its military brilliance, now seem like it was on the defensive? His anger was misdirected. The answer was not in strategy. It was in supply chains, in assembly lines, in factories like Willow Run that never slept. The tide was not turning. It had already turned. And while the German command clung to outdated models of prestige and pilot prowess, the United States pressed forward with numbers that told their own story. More bombers, more fuel, more men, more reach, and behind every bomber, the same sound. That low, relentless, mechanical hum that said without words what leaflets and broadcasts never could. This is not your sky anymore. If this chapter made you feel something, frustration, awe, or even sadness, share your reaction below. These are more than stories. They are echoes of choices, systems, and people who lived through impossible decisions. Join us in keeping these memories alive. Subscribe and help us carry the voices of history into the future. The hum never stopped. Inside the belly of Willow Run, the rhythm of war sounded nothing like gunfire or sirens. It was the clang of metal, the hiss of welding torches, the shuffle of boots over concrete, and the chorus of 1,000 voices moving in sync. Here time did not tick. It roared. And every 55 minutes without fail, the factory gave birth to a new bomber. A fully assembled B-24 Liberator rolled off the line ready to fly. No ceremony, no pause. Just motion, relentless, measured, industrial motion. This was not just production. This was orchestration on a scale the world had never seen. Every component of the B-24 arrived on site with timing that bordered on the supernatural. Crates of engines came from Buick and Flint, landing gear from Cleveland, instruments from Chicago, glass panels from Toledo. Even the paint, a dull matte olive drab, was manufactured to dry at the precise moment the bomber left the final assembly bay. Every morning, entire trains unloaded fresh parts into one side of the facility. Forklifts and motorized carts carried those components into waiting zones where workers immediately began installation. By nightfall, the parts from that same shipment had become wings, fuselages, and rudders bolted into place with a speed that defied logic. In many cases, the same bolt that was touched by a machinist in New York on a Tuesday would be flying over Europe by Friday. Inside the factory, workers were assigned to microtasks. One man's entire role might be to attach a single hydraulic fitting to the same point on every aircraft. Over and over, hour after hour, it was monotonous, repetitive, and critical. Because the magic of Willow Run was not in creativity, it was in precision. Every person was a cog, but the machine they powered was bigger than all of them. To keep the plant running 24 hours a day, workers were split into shifts. There were night crews who never saw the sun, and day workers who lived by the factory whistle. Meals were eaten on the go. Conversations were short. There were no slow moments, and there was no silence. Sleep was often sacrificed, not for glory, but for necessity. By 1944, the factory employed over 42,000 people. It had its own medical staff, fire brigade, housing for transient laborers, and even a child care center for working mothers. Willow Run was more than a plant. It was a self-contained city, a city built to fight a war. Among its most remarkable features was the curve at the end of the assembly line. The building had been designed so long that if it continued straight, it would cross into another state. To avoid a legal nightmare, engineers bent the line into a giant L shape. This made the final leg of the bomber's berth a sweeping turn toward the runway, where test pilots waited with clipboards in quiet anticipation. The first time a bomber rolled down that curve and took flight, the cheers were spontaneous. Workers lined up along the edge of the floor, grease on their faces, tears in their eyes. Some waved. Others just watched in stunned silence as a machine they helped build lifted into the sky. It was no longer a blueprint or a part number. It was real, and it was gone. Off to war. But the celebration never lasted long, because by the time one plane cleared the hangar doors, another was already on its way. The line never waited. Behind the efficiency was a deep current of sacrifice. Accidents happened, fingers were lost, eyes burned by sparks. Workers collapsed from exhaustion. Others worked double shifts, barely earning enough to send money back to family. But they stayed, because each person believed that their wrench, their rivet, their wire was a small blow against tyranny, and the stakes were understood. Every hour the factory ran uninterrupted meant one more crew had a chance to survive. One more target could be hit. One more mission could go forward. Every bomber that left Willow Run carried not just bombs, but the weight of American resolve. Even the labeling system inside the factory spoke to this mindset. Planes were not numbered chronologically. They were assigned completion times. In the logbooks, it did not say built on April 5th. It said completed at 08:55. That level of granularity reflected how seriously time was measured, because the enemy did not sleep, and neither could the line. The delivery system was equally astonishing. Once a bomber passed its final inspections, it was fueled, armed with training loads, and flown out directly from the adjacent airstrip. Some flights went west for further outfitting. Others went east, directly into combat training rotations. The goal was zero downtime, a seamless handoff between factory and frontline. To maximize this handoff, Ford installed a team of test pilots whose only job was to fly each new B-24 and log its performance. They wore no uniforms, carried no rank, and often worked longer hours than the assembly line itself. It was said they knew every rattle, every vibration a plane should make. One pilot famously grounded an aircraft because a single panel vibrated differently than expected. That plane was later found to have a loose fuel line. His intuition saved 10 lives. Stories like these became legends inside the plant. Workers passed them around during breaks like folklore. The man who set a record for installing a tailgun in under 4 minutes. The woman who spotted a flaw in the landing gear blueprint and prevented dozens of potential crashes. They were not soldiers, but they were warriors in their own way, and they carried their battles in calloused hands and sleepless eyes. Despite all this, very few Americans outside the plant knew what was really happening at Willow Run. Security was tight. Cameras were forbidden. Even family members were not allowed into certain areas. What they built was secret, and what they achieved was immeasurable. But the enemy knew. Captured German documents later revealed that Luftwaffe intelligence had begun tracking the output of Willow Run by mid-1943. They knew it was producing at a rate previously thought impossible. They just could not understand how. One officer, in a moment of raw confusion, wrote simply, "They build like we breathe." He was not wrong. Willow Run was a factory, but it was also a response. A reply to terror with tempo, to fear with function. Every tool lifted, there was a quiet declaration that America would not wait for the storm to pass. It would build its own storm and send it back. If this part of the journey moved you or made you reflect, take a moment to drop your thoughts in the comments. These stories deserve to be remembered not just as facts, but as proof of what people can build when the world needs them most. And if you want more, hit subscribe and stay with us as we bring forgotten history back into the light. The numbers were staggering. By 1945, over 50,000 American airmen had died in the skies over Europe. Most of them were bomber crewmen. They were not just statistics, they were names scrawled on dog tags, photos tucked into flight jackets, letters half-written and never sent. Each one had a story that ended somewhere between takeoff and landing, between the cold wind over the channel and the smoke-choked clouds of the Ruhr. To understand the cost of the air war, you have to start in the belly of a B-24, cramped, loud, freezing cold at altitude, oxygen masks required above 10,000 feet. Heated suits often failed. Frostbite was common. The interior rattled constantly from engine vibration and wind shear. Crews sat shoulder to shoulder, each man encased in his duty station like a cog inside a trembling watch. They were surrounded by aluminum walls barely thicker than a coin. Most of these men were in their early 20s. Some had never left their home state before the war. Now they were flying 5 miles above the earth, trusting their lives to machines built by strangers and held together by rivets and faith. The flight from England to a target deep in Germany could take 6 hours or more. That was 6 hours of silence punctuated by radio bursts, by the tightening of parachute harnesses, by the hum of engines that masked 1,000 private thoughts. Some prayed, others sang softly to themselves. Most just watched the horizon. Then the flak started. German anti-aircraft guns were not subtle. They were designed to create a wall of exploding metal thousands of feet wide. Shells were timed to detonate at a specific altitude, scattering red-hot shrapnel through the sky. Crews called it flying through a furnace. The bombers held course, always forward. Deviating meant risking the entire formation. When flak hit, it came without warning. A burst near the wing could tear off a section of control surface. A hit to the nose could kill the bombardier instantly. Some planes caught fire. Others simply vanished. No parachutes, no debris, just gone. If flak did not get you, fighters might. German interceptors often waited until the bombers were deep in enemy territory and low on fuel. The attack came fast. From the front, from below, sometimes from the sun. Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs diving at over 400 miles per hour. One pass, guns blazing. Then another. And another. The bombers' gunners would return fire with everything they had. 50 caliber rounds spat from waist guns, nose turrets, tail sections. In those moments, the sky was less a battlefield and more a furnace. A single mission could see entire squadrons lost. A tight formation of 20 bombers might return with half their number. The rest were marked as missing. MIA. No word, no wreckage, just silence. Inside the returning aircraft, the scene was rarely clean. Windows shattered, instruments hanging by wires, wings scorched, blood on the floor. Some crew members were carried out unconscious. Others climbed down the ladder silently, eyes unfocused, uniforms soaked in oil and grief. And yet, they went back. They did not talk much about the danger. They did not complain. In the debriefing tents, officers asked for mission reports. The gunners recounted what they saw, how many fighters, what direction they came from, how many enemy aircraft were shot down. But the real story was written on their faces. There was a rule. If you survived 25 missions, you went home. That was the magic number, the golden ticket. But few made it that far. The odds were brutal. Early in the war, bomber crews had only a 30% chance of surviving those 25 missions. Still, they climbed aboard again and again. Some carried good luck charms, a photo, a rabbit's foot, a coin. Others had rituals. Left boot first. Same song before takeoff. Silence during taxi. These small gestures became lifelines, ways to control the uncontrollable. And even when they did survive, they were never the same. Many returned with what today we would call trauma. Back then it was just nerves, or battle fatigue, or nothing at all. There were no terms for the shaking hands, the nightmares, the fear of loud noises. They were expected to return, go home, get jobs, start families. And some did, but part of them always stayed in the sky. Perhaps the most heartbreaking truth is that their sacrifice was rarely seen. Bombers flew miles above the ground. Their missions were invisible to those below. Cities saw the destruction, but not the cost. Not the faces of the men who never came back. Not the empty chairs in mess halls. Not the way surviving crew members looked at the sky afterward, as if still listening for a sound they could not name. This was the cost of air supremacy. Not just aluminum and fuel, but lives given one mission at a time. The price of trying to end a war from above. Some would argue it worked, that the bombing campaign crippled the German war machine, that it forced resources away from the front, that it broke morale. Others argue the price was too high, that too many were lost for too little. But whatever history decides, the men who climbed into those B-24s did so with no guarantee, no glory, just a mission, and the hope that this time, maybe this time, they would make it home. If this part of the story touched you, let your voice be heard in the comments. These were not just pilots and gunners. They were brothers, sons, and friends who never asked for fame. Let us keep their memory alive by remembering what they gave. And if you believe stories like this matter, subscribe and be part of our mission to honor the past with truth. By late 1943, the Luftwaffe was bleeding. What once had been a proud and agile air force, the master of blitzkrieg and the terror of Western Europe, was now caught in a spiral. Day after day, waves of American bombers crossed the skies of France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and deep into Germany itself. With each mission, more losses piled up. Not just planes, but men. And with every squadron that failed to return, a question began to echo inside the halls of German command. How long could they hold? At first, the German response was aggressive. Fighter bases were repositioned. New tactics developed. Specialized units were trained to intercept bombers from above and below. Pilots were ordered to aim not at the fuselage but at the cockpit, the engines, the fuel tanks. Anything that would bring the giants down faster. For a while it worked. Missions like Schweinfurt and Regensburg saw devastating American losses. Dozens of B-24s and B-17s failed to return. Crews were killed or captured. The cost was rising rapidly, but so was production. For every bomber lost over the fatherland, Willow Run and dozens of other factories rolled out more. Faster, smarter, better armed. The Germans destroyed 10, and 20 arrived the next week. They downed 20, and 30 followed. The American system was not just resilient, it was regenerative. Industrial superiority had entered the war like a silent tide, and Germany was starting to drown. In response, the Luftwaffe rushed new aircraft into service. The Focke-Wulf 190 was upgraded. The Messerschmitt 109 was pushed to its design limits. Then came the radical ones, the rocket-powered Me-163 Comet, the jet engine Me-262. Technological marvels, years ahead of their time. But they arrived too late, too few, and with too little fuel to make a difference. Fuel had become a ghost. The very blood of the Luftwaffe was disappearing. Allied bombing raids targeted refineries, railroads, depots. Every gallon destroyed on the ground was one less in the air. Fighter squadrons were grounded for days waiting on fuel deliveries that never came. Training hours for new pilots were cut to the bone. Some Luftwaffe rookies went into combat with less than 10 flight hours. Many would never return from their first mission. Worse still, experienced veterans were dying faster than they could be replaced. By 1944, most German fighter wings were staffed by boys, 18, 19 years old. Brave, yes, but green, and facing swarms of bombers and long-range American escort fighters that now reached into the heart of Germany. That was the final dagger, the arrival of the P-51 Mustang. With drop tanks and extended range, Mustangs could escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back. The Luftwaffe could no longer attack without being attacked. Dogfights turned into massacres. German pilots were caught in the crossfire of heavy bombers and agile escorts. They fought with fury, with desperation. But even desperation has limits. By the summer of 1944, entire German airfields were destroyed before planes could even take off. Runways were cratered. Hangars collapsed. Supplies vanished in firestorms. The Allies did not just win in the air. They took the air away from the enemy. Every flight the Luftwaffe attempted became a coin toss. Every engagement burned more pilots than planes. German command fell into denial. Reports were rewritten to sound more optimistic. Orders became more erratic. Some officers clung to the hope that new wonder weapons would change the tide. Others simply lied. They claimed victory where there had been retreat. They promised strength where only ashes remained. But the pilots knew. They watched their comrades fall. They felt the shortage of parts, of ammunition, of fuel, of hope. In flight briefings, there was silence. No jokes, no bravado. Only the quiet nods of men who understood they were being asked to stand against a machine too large to break. Because by now the American war machine was not just building airplanes. It was building a new reality. The strategy was no longer to defeat the enemy pilot. It was to outlast him, overwhelm him, exhaust him, and eventually erase him. For every 1,000 pounds of bombs dropped on German factories, another crack appeared in the foundation of the Reich. It was not just physical destruction, it was mental, psychological. The Luftwaffe was not just running out of aircraft, it was running out of belief. A German radar operator stationed near Leipzig once wrote in his diary, "I no longer count the planes. I only count the minutes until the noise stops." That noise, the low growl of 4 engines, had become a symbol. To some, it meant liberation. To others, doom. It was not the sharp cry of battle, but the slow, methodical drumbeat of inevitability. And when the B-24s passed overhead, they no longer inspired attack. They inspired awe and fear, because the Germans had learned a painful truth. You can fight a soldier, you can fight a pilot, but you cannot fight a factory. The Reich's greatest weakness had never been its technology or its tactics. It was its refusal to accept that wars are won not just in trenches or skies, but in shipping yards, assembly lines, and supply chains. And in that arena, America was untouchable. If this part of history stirred something in you, share your thoughts in the comments. These are not just accounts of war. They are the final echoes of an empire that forgot what truly fuels victory. Subscribe to stay with us as we continue unearthing the stories that shape how we remember the past. It did not roar like a fighter or glide like a falcon. It moved with purpose, with weight, and with certainty. The B-24 Liberator was never designed to be elegant. It was never meant to be feared for its agility or admired for its beauty. It was meant to arrive, to deliver, and to return. And behind its thick aluminum skin, behind its riveted panels and roaring engines, lived a quiet truth that would define the outcome of the war. This was not a plane born from artistic ambition. It was born from a spreadsheet. Every inch of the B-24's frame had been calculated to serve a single function: efficiency. Its flat-sided fuselage was easier and cheaper to produce than the rounded contours of its cousin, the B-17. Its high aspect ratio wings gave it superior range and lift. Its internal bomb bay, divided by a central catwalk, allowed for more payload and faster rearming. It was not pretty, but it was effective. And effectiveness is what wins industrial wars. Because by the time the B-24 took to the skies in vast formations, the war had already shifted. It was no longer a contest of brilliant generals or daring pilots. It had become a test of systems, a question of who could organize faster, produce more, and deliver with consistency. And in that arena, the United States had weaponized something far more dangerous than any aircraft. It had weaponized time. While the Reich continued to value craftsmanship and specialized production, American factories redefined what it meant to build for war. A German aircraft like the Focke-Wulf 190 took an average of 9,000 man-hours to complete. A B-24 from Willow Run required just under 3,000. And while the Luftwaffe waited on scarce resources and precision tools, the Ford plant in Michigan had turned every component into a puzzle piece that fit exactly when and where it was needed. That was the brilliance behind the madness. The Germans saw planes. The Americans saw flowcharts. The Germans saw strategy. The Americans saw logistics. And that difference rewrote the future. In German planning rooms, targets were selected based on priority. In American factories, bombers were built to hit all of them at once. And they did, day after day. The raids were not just about destruction. They were about volume, repetition, pressure. Imagine the sound of a bomber formation overhead. Not a few planes, not a squadron, hundreds. Each one carrying up to 8,000 pounds of bombs. Each one flanked by escort fighters. Each one dispatched with the timing of a production line and the cold precision of a supply chain. This was the new language of war. Not one of bravery or medals, but of metrics and margins. And nowhere was that more apparent than in the contrast between the opposing doctrines. The German high command still clung to the ideal of the ace pilot, a man with a name and a face, one who could rack up kills and become a symbol of national pride. But the Americans had moved on. They did not build heroes. They built capacity. When a bomber was lost, the factory did not mourn. It accelerated. When a pilot was killed, training centers doubled their output. The strategy was not rooted in emotion. It was embedded in math, and it worked. By mid-1944, American production had reached such a scale that planes were being delivered faster than they could be deployed. Storage airfields known as boneyards filled with aircraft waiting for crews. Bombers sat in rows, engines covered, waiting for the moment they would be called. It was not a shortage of material. It was a surplus. In Germany, meanwhile, aircraft were being flown directly off the line into combat. There was no reserve, no delay, just urgency, desperation. This difference shaped the battlefield. Allied missions became more ambitious, targets deeper, formations larger. While German commanders scrambled to defend their infrastructure, the Americans simply moved to the next location on the list. If a factory was rebuilt, it was bombed again. If an airfield resurfaced, it was cratered within days. There was no pause, no reset, only momentum. The B-24 became a flying metaphor for this new kind of warfare. It was not fast, but it was steady. Not perfect, but repeatable. It did not need to win in a dogfight. It needed to get there, drop its load, and vanish into the clouds before the enemy could regroup. And because it came not alone, but in masses, it overwhelmed defenses not through superiority, but through scale. Some German officers began calling the bombing campaigns the Iron Rain, not because of the bombs, but because of their inevitability. Like weather patterns, unstoppable, predictable, relentless. Behind it all was the unseen hand of American industry, the workers who never fired a weapon, but who fought with drills and torque wrenches, the engineers who calculated angles and tolerances instead of tactics, the managers who measured success, not in territory taken, but in units shipped. They were the real architects of air supremacy. And their blueprints were not battle plans. They were assembly schedules. Henry Ford once said that thinking is the hardest work there is, which is probably why so few engage in it. But in the war, thinking won. Systems thinking, process thinking, industrial thinking. Because when the smoke cleared and the silence returned, it was not the flash of victory that defined the outcome. It was the rhythm, the beat of a machine that never stopped. And when historians ask how an army can fight with such consistency, the answer is simple. The army was not alone. It had a factory behind it. If this perspective helped you see the war through a new lens, let us know in the comments. These are more than stories. They are reminders that sometimes the loudest victories are built in quiet places. Subscribe and stay with us as we continue exploring the machinery behind history. It was no longer a battle. It had become a rhythm. By the spring of 1945, the skies over Germany no longer held suspense. There was no guessing, no anticipation, no mystery. The drone of engines arrived like clockwork, a low rolling thunder that echoed through the valleys, over the rivers, across cities already reduced to rubble. It was not one squadron or one mission. It was a calendar, a schedule written in oil and steel, enforced not by strategy, but by inertia. Every morning, radar stations detected the same patterns, hundreds of dots forming neat V formations on the screens. Officers no longer asked where the bombers were coming from. They asked what was left to bomb. The B24 Liberator, once mocked for its shape and simplicity, now filled the German sky like a warning, a boxcar in the clouds, a reminder of a war that had turned industrial, and of a factory that never stopped moving. There was no longer fear in the traditional sense. There was resignation. German citizens heard the distant hum and no longer ran for shelter. Some simply looked up, pausing in silence. Others kept walking, because what else could they do? They had learned that the bombers did not come alone. They came with squadrons of fighters, with formations so tight they seemed to move as one. They came with precision and with repetition. A day missed was a day delayed, not a day spared. The Luftwaffe was a memory. Most of its pilots were dead, captured, or grounded by lack of fuel. Its runways were craters. Its hangars burned out skeletons. The Reich had gambled on speed, on surprise, on force, but it had never prepared for persistence. The final days of the war were filled with silence between the noise. When the bombers passed, a stillness settled. Cities stood motionless under their shadows, too broken to react. The sound of the B-24 was no longer an event. It was an environment. Even Hitler in his final bunker briefings could not escape the reality. Reports from commanders made it clear. The American war machine was no longer an invading force. It was a constant presence, like wind, like gravity, unstoppable because it no longer needed momentum. It had become momentum. And behind it all, thousands of miles away, Willow Run still moved. Even as Germany burned, even as victory approached, the line kept producing. Because victory was not assumed. It had to be earned. One aircraft, 1 hour, one rivet at a time. It is easy now to look back at that time and focus on the big moments. The flags raised, the speeches given, the treaties signed. But the truth is, the war was not won in a single moment. It was won in millions of moments, in the hands of a worker tightening a bolt in Michigan, in the eyes of a young pilot guiding a trembling B-24 through flak, in the silent nod between crew members who knew this mission might be their last. The B-24 did not win the war because it was perfect. It won because it showed up, again and again, and because behind every mission, behind every bomb bay and broken wing, stood the full weight of a nation that had learned to turn resolve into machinery. By May of 1945, Germany had nothing left to fight with. The skies belonged to the United States, not because of courage alone, but because of cadence, not because of strength alone, but because of structure, not because of heroes alone, but because of hands, hands that built, hands that loaded, hands that flew, hands that never stopped moving forward. The sound of the B-24 faded eventually. The factories shut down. The lines went quiet. The war ended. But its echoes remain, in history, in memory, and in the lessons it left behind, that no matter how brutal the enemy may be, no matter how powerful their weapons or terrifying their tactics, a nation that learns to build, to organize, to outlast, cannot be defeated, and that sometimes the most powerful sound in a war is not the gunfire, not the bombs, but the steady hum of a factory that will not stop. If this story meant something to you, if it made you feel the weight behind the wings, leave a comment below. We read them all. We carry these stories together. And if you believe in honoring the past with truth and clarity, subscribe now. There's always more to uncover, more forgotten echoes to remember. And when you're ready, click on the next video that's about to appear on your screen. Thank you for watching. And thank you, truly, for helping us keep history alive.